The crashed Starship contained a royal passenger. The human engineer had no idea who she was. The beacon went off at 3:47, which was, in Kael's professional opinion, an absolutely unholy hour for the universe to start collapsing. He knew it was serious before he even opened his eyes, because the alert wasn't the soft chime that meant a supply drone had drifted off course, or the slightly more urgent buzz that meant somebody's atmospheric seal had a slow leak. This was the third tone, the one that lived at the bottom of the priority list precisely because nobody wanted to hear it. Full hull breach, unknown vessel, distress signal active. Kael had heard it exactly twice in 4 years stationed on Havers Ridge, and both times it had meant a long night, a longer report, and a sandwich he never got to finish. The sandwich, this time, was turkey. He looked at it with real grief before grabbing his jacket. "You'll keep," he told it, which was a lie, because nothing kept on Havers Ridge. The air recyclers ran a little too dry and turned every piece of bread into something resembling roofing material within the hour. But it felt important to say something encouraging to someone, even if that someone was a sandwich, before climbing into a rescue crawler in the dark to go find out what had just turned a chunk of the northern ridge into a smoking ditch. The drive out was short, which was the only mercy the night offered. Havers Ridge wasn't much of a posting, a tired moon with a thin, scraped-together atmosphere, valuable mostly for the mineral processing station that justified Kael's entire reason for being there, and otherwise mostly known for being extremely good at making things crash into it. Gravity wells did that. Kael had given up being surprised by it years ago, the same way he'd given up being surprised by his own paycheck, his own diet, and the particular flavor of loneliness that came from doing emergency response work in a place where the emergencies mostly involved rocks. This one did not involve a rock. He saw the wreck before he saw the trench it had carved, because the wreck was, even in its destroyed state, clearly not anything that came out of a human shipyard. The hull plating had a strange iridescence to it, like the inside of a shell, and the architecture of the thing, what was left of it, curved in ways that suggested someone who didn't believe in right angles had designed it on a good day. It had gouged a furrow nearly half a kilometer long into the regolith before finally giving up and stopping, which told Kael two things. It had been moving very fast, and whoever built it had also built it tough enough to survive that kind of stop, which was either impressive engineering or extremely good luck. "Okay," Kael said out loud to no one, parking the crawler at a respectful distance and grabbing his kit. "Okay, sure, that's a thing that's happening." He had protocols for first contact. Everyone on every outpost did, drilled into them during onboarding alongside fire safety and the proper disposal of biohazard waste, and approximately as often used. The protocols mostly amounted to don't shoot first, try to communicate, and call it in immediately, none of which felt especially useful standing in front of a wreck that was venting a thin trail of vapor into the cold dark and showing zero signs of anybody inside being capable of conversation. He called it in anyway. Static answered him, which made sense once he noticed the comms relay tower half a click away had a very ship-shaped dent in it. "Fantastic," Kael said, to the static, to the dent, to the universe generally. Of course that happened. There was no time to wait for backup that wasn't coming, not with the kind of heat signature his handheld was reading off the wreck's interior. So he did the thing his job actually required of him, which was go inside and see if anyone needed saving before deciding what else needed doing about it. The interior of the ship was unlike anything in the engineering manuals he'd memorized. All soft curving corridors and panels that pulsed faint light in patterns he didn't recognize, some of them flickering weakly like a heartbeat losing its rhythm. He moved carefully, kit slung over one shoulder, calling out hello, into the dark with the specific, slightly embarrassed tone of someone who didn't expect an answer and would feel silly if one came. One came. It was faint, more breath than word, but it pulled him down a side corridor to a chamber where the lighting had failed almost entirely. And there, half collapsed against a console that was still sparking intermittently like it hadn't gotten the message that the ship was done, was a woman. His first thought professionally was, multiple visible injuries, possible internal trauma, get her stable. His second thought, less professionally, arrived about half a second later and concerned her ears, which tapered into long, elegant points that had absolutely no business existing on a face otherwise so thoroughly. Unremarkably human, pale skin gone paler with shock, blonde hair, matted with something that wasn't blood, but was clearly not supposed to be in her hair either. Eyes that opened halfway when he got close and fixed on him, with an expression somewhere between wariness and exhaustion. "Hi," Kael said, because it seemed like the thing to say. "I'm going to help you. Try not to do anything dramatic like dying while I figure out how." She made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been a cough, possibly both at once, which he decided to take as a good sign. He ran the scanner over her, standard model, built for human physiology, which it informed him with mild electronic confusion was apparently close enough to whatever she was that it could still give him useful numbers, though it flagged her ear structure as an anomaly approximately 4 times in a row like it was personally offended by the inconsistency. 2 fractures, a concussion probably, bruising that would turn spectacular colors in a day or two, but nothing his kit couldn't address well enough to get her stabilized and moved. "What's your name?" he asked, mostly to keep her talking patience being generally preferable to quiet ones. "Thessara," she managed, the word costing her something. "Just Thessara." "Just Thessara," she confirmed, in a tone that suggested the subject was closed, which was fine by Kael, because his kit didn't have a field for last name and he wasn't about to argue with a woman who currently had a piece of her own ship's console embedded faintly in her shoulder. "Okay, Thessara. I'm Kael. I'm going to splint this arm and it's going to hurt, and I'm sorry in advance, and also I want it on record that I think your ship has terrible taste in parking." That earned him the real laugh this time, small and surprised, like she hadn't expected to find anything funny today, and was a little annoyed at herself for being wrong. "It wasn't parking," she said, through gritted teeth as he worked. "It was an emergency descent." "Sure, that's what they all say." He kept his hands steady, his voice light, because the steadier and lighter he kept both, the steadier she seemed to get, which was its own kind of useful data. "In my experience, every ship that ends up in a ditch insists it meant to be there. This ship," she said, "did not mean to be anywhere near here." "Yeah, well, join the club. Nobody means to be on Havers Ridge. It's sort of the whole identity of the place." She didn't answer that, eyes drifting shut again, and Kael picked up the pace, splinting what needed splinting, stabilizing what needed stabilizing, keeping up a steady stream of mostly nonsense talk because the alternative was silence. And silence in a half-dead ship with a half-conscious passenger and no working comms felt like exactly the wrong kind of quiet to allow. He got her onto the stretcher, out through the buckled airlock and into the thin, cold night, the moon's sparse stars wheeling indifferently overhead while somewhere far above them. Though Kael had no way of knowing this, would not have believed it if told. An entire fleet had gone very quiet, very fast, having just lost all contact with the one ship in the galaxy it could least afford to lose. The shelter wasn't built for 2 people, which Kael discovered approximately 4 minutes after dragging Thessara's stretcher through the airlock, when he realized the only flat surface large enough to serve as a bed was the one he usually slept on himself. "You can have the cot," he said, easing her onto it with more care than grace. "I'll take the floor. It's not as bad as it sounds. I've slept on worse." "Comforting," Thessara murmured, eyes still half-closed, voice thin as wire. "I once spent 6 months sleeping in a mineral cart because the bunk module flooded. The floor is a 5-star upgrade from that." She didn't answer, which worried him more than any complaint would have, so he set about doing what he actually knew how to do, which was triage and stabilize and monitor, the parts of the job that didn't require him to be clever. just competent. The storm outside had picked up exactly on schedule. Havers Ridge's weather system apparently taking personal offense at the idea of an easy night, and the shelter's outer plating groaned under wind that sounded like it had opinions about the structural integrity of the building. He got her hydrated, got the worst of the wounds cleaned and properly closed, got a stim patch on her that his scanner assured him, after another 4 rounds of confused beeping about her physiology, was probably safe to use. Probably. He decided not to mention the word probably out loud. By the time the storm had fully committed to making the night miserable, Thessara was conscious again, propped against the wall with her splinted leg elevated on a crate of spare parts, watching him with the wary, assessing look of someone who'd woken up in an unfamiliar place and was doing the math on whether that was a problem. "You're not asking who I am," she said. "I asked. You said Thessara." Conversation seemed pretty closed after that. "Most people would push." Kael shrugged, checking the seal on her splint one more time out of habit rather than necessity. "Most people aren't doing inventory on emergency rations at 1 in the morning while a stranger bleeds gently in their living room. I've got limited bandwidth tonight. Your backstory's going on the wait list." That got the laugh again, the small surprised one, like it kept catching her off guard that she was capable of it. "You're very calm about all this. I work rescue and salvage on a rock most people forget exists. Calm is the only personality trait the job lets me keep." He held up a ration pack with the specific apologetic expression of a man about to disappoint someone. "Speaking of which, dinner. I want to be honest with you about what this is before you commit to eating it." "What is it?" "Officially, protein paste with reconstituted vegetable matter. Unofficially, I think it's punishment for a crime the supply chain committed against me personally." He handed it over anyway. "It's not poison. I want to be clear about that part. It's just deeply, deeply sad food." She took it, examined it with the air of someone evaluating a hostile alien artifact, which, given the ears, struck Kael as a faintly funny reversal he chose not to point out. She ate it slowly, grimacing once, and said, "This is terrible. I know. You eat this regularly. I have a complicated relationship with it. We've been through a lot together." He sat down across from her, back against the wall, finally letting himself feel the adrenaline drain out of his shoulders now that the immediate crisis had downgraded itself to merely ongoing. "You want to talk about the part where your ship doesn't look like it was built by anyone I've ever heard of?" Something in her expression went carefully neutral. "It was an independent design." "Independent design," Kael repeated, in the tone of a man filing that answer away under things that are technically words. "Sure. Independent of what gravity, because that landing did not respect gravity's feelings at all." "It was an emergency descent," she said again, the same flat insistence from the wreck, though there was the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth now, like she knew exactly how unconvincing it sounded, and had decided to enjoy that rather than fight it. "Right, the emergency descent, I remember, very controlled, very intentional. The half-kilometer trench was just for show. It added drama. It added a lot of drama. I had to recalibrate my whole evening around your drama." He gestured vaguely at the shelter, the storm, the general chaos of his night. "I had a sandwich. I want you to know that. I had a sandwich and a plan, and both of those are dead now because of your ship's commitment to theatrical entrances." Thessara actually smiled at that, a real one, brief and a little startled at itself. And for a moment the wariness in her face eased into something more like simple tiredness, the kind that came after surviving something rather than the kind that came before it. "I'm sorry about your sandwich. It was a good sandwich, turkey. I'd had plans for it." He let the joke sit for a second before continuing, because he could see her energy fading again, the conversation working like a kind of medicine but one with a limited dose. "You should sleep. Your body's doing a lot of repair work right now, and it'd rather not also be making small talk while it does it. You're very direct. Occupational hazard. Out here you don't have time to be subtle about things. If something's wrong, you say it's wrong. If someone's dying, you say that too, generally before they finish the sentence about how they're fine. He nodded at her leg. For the record, you are not fine. I've had worse. I'm sure you have. I'm also sure that's not the flex you think it is. He stood, gathering the empty ration packaging, glancing toward the window where the storm threw handfuls of fine grit against the reinforced glass like the moon itself, was annoyed they'd both survived the night without its permission. Comms are still down. Relay tower took a hit from your ship's dramatic descent, so it's just us until the weather clears enough for me to fix it or for someone to notice you're missing and come looking. Something flickered across her face at that, fast, complicated, gone before he could properly read it, but all she said was, "How long does weather like this usually last? Out here could be a day, could be 3. Havers Ridge doesn't believe in moderation." He settled onto the floor with a blanket that had definitely seen better decades, propping himself against the wall near enough to hear her if anything went wrong, far enough to give her whatever privacy a one-room shelter could offer. "Get some sleep. I'll wake you up every few hours to make sure your brain's still doing its job. Standard concussion protocol. Try not to take it personally. And if I don't want to be woken up, then I'll wake you up anyway, because my job isn't actually about what patients want. It's about what keeps them alive long enough to complain about it later." He closed his eyes, already half drifting despite himself, the long, strange day finally catching up with his body, even as his mind kept circling back to the same useless, unanswerable question. Who builds a ship like that, who survives a crash like that, and who answers to nothing but a first name while doing it? Outside, the storm kept arguing with the shelter walls. Inside, for the first time since the beacon had gone off, things were quiet enough that Kael could almost believe, for a few hours at least, that this might just turn out to be a strange story he'd tell later rather than the beginning of something considerably larger than either of them currently understood. The storm held on for 2 full days, which gave Kael more time than he'd expected to discover that Thessara was, against every reasonable assumption a crash victim should be allowed, an extremely opinionated houseguest. "This music is an act of violence," she announced on the second morning, when he'd put on the only playlist his terminal had stored locally, a collection of old mining ballads his predecessor had left behind along with 3 broken multi-tools and a suspicious amount of expired coffee. "It's classic," Kael said, affronted on behalf of a genre he didn't even particularly like. "It's heritage. It's the sound of human beings extracting minerals from hostile rock with their bare hands and their stubborn refusal to die. It sounds like the hostile rock fighting back. That's just called texture. It's called an attack on my eardrums, which, I will remind you, are currently the only part of me not injured, so maybe consider being gentler with them." She said it with the particular dry delivery that he'd started to realize was just how she talked when she felt safe enough to be difficult, which he'd decided to take as a compliment rather than a complaint, mostly because the alternative, that she simply found him annoying, was less fun to believe. "Fine, new rule. I turn off the music, you stop critiquing my cooking." "I haven't said anything about your cooking. You made a face, I saw the face. It's hard not to make a face at something that color. It's stew. It's a warning." He laughed despite himself, the kind of unguarded laugh that came easier with her than it had with most people he worked alongside out here, where conversation tended to orbit maintenance schedules and ore yields and very little else. There was something about Thessara that resisted the careful, professional distance he usually kept with strangers. Not pushy, exactly, but unwilling to let a silence sit unchallenged. The way she'd needle at him about the shelter's questionable plumbing or interrogate him about why he'd chosen a posting this remote, like she genuinely wanted to know rather than just filling air. "So why here?" she asked that afternoon, propped against the wall with her legs still elevated, color back in her face now in a way that made the whole situation feel marginally less dire. Of all the places a person could end up, why a moon famous for nothing except making things crash into it? Pays well, asks few questions, has excellent crash into it statistics as you've personally helped confirm. He was running a diagnostic on her splint, checking the bone alignment with the patience of someone who'd rather be thorough than fast. Also, I'm good at this. The fixing things part. Ships, equipment, occasionally entire moons worth of busted relay towers. There's not a lot of glory in it, but there's something satisfying about taking something broken and making it work again. Even when the something broken is uncooperative. He glanced up at her. No offense. None taken. I have been uncooperative. It's been a long week. You want to talk about that week? The question landed lighter than he meant it, but he watched something close behind her eyes anyway, quick and practiced, like a door sliding shut on a room she didn't want him looking into. Not yet, she said. Okay. Just okay. No follow-up question, no gentle prying disguised as concern. I'm an engineer, not an interrogator. If a part doesn't want to come loose, you don't force it. You figure out what's actually holding it in place and work with that instead. You'll tell me when you're ready, or you won't. And either way, I've got a relay tower to fix once this storm quits being dramatic about everything. He nodded toward the window, where the wind had finally started losing its conviction, the worst of the grit no longer hammering the glass quite so insistently. Speaking of which, looks like the moon's calming down. We might actually get a signal out today. Something crossed her face at that. Not relief, exactly, more like the bracing a person does before a door they know is about to open. That's good, she said, in a voice that didn't entirely sound like she meant it. You don't sound thrilled. I am thrilled, extremely. Calms are wonderful. She said it with such aggressive cheerfulness that Kael nearly laughed again, except this time there was something underneath it he couldn't quite name. Something that made him set the diagnostic scanner down and actually look at her properly. Hey, he said, whatever's waiting on the other end of that signal, it's not going to be worse than crashing a ship into a moon and getting stuck eating my cooking for 2 days. I feel like you've already cleared the bar for worst week. You'd be surprised. Try me. She studied him for a long moment, that same assessing look from the first night. Like she was running her own version of his diagnostic scanner over him, checking for something the readout couldn't quite confirm. Maybe later, she said finally. Ask me again once the tower's working. Deal, I'm very good at remembering debts. Ask anyone I've ever loaned a multi-tool to. That earned a genuine laugh, the kind that creased the corners of her eyes, and for a while they let the conversation drift somewhere lighter, Kael describing, with theatrical despair. The year a supply error sent him 400 crates of identical gray socks, instead of the spare filtration units he'd actually ordered. Thesara countering with a story, carefully scrubbed of any identifying detail. About an official function she'd once attended that had been derailed entirely by a malfunctioning floating centerpiece that chased a particularly important guest around the room for 20 minutes, while everyone pretended not to notice. Who just lets a floating centerpiece attack someone for 20 minutes? Kael demanded. Protocol is complicated. Protocol should not include. Allow the murder hover decoration to finish its rounds. You'd be amazed what protocol allows, she said, and there was something wry and tired in it that told him this wasn't really a story about a centerpiece at all. But he let it go, because pulling on that thread felt like exactly the kind of forcing he'd told her he didn't believe in. By evening, the storm had thinned to an irritated drizzle of fine dust, and Kael suited up to make the trek out to the relay tower, leaving Thesara propped up with strict instructions not to do anything heroic involving her leg while he was gone. The walk out was short, the repair work shorter still, a fried coupling, easily swapped, the kind of fix that made him feel briefly competent at something larger than ration pack inventory. And when the tower's lights flickered back to steady green, his handheld lit up almost immediately with a backlog of alerts that had clearly been queuing up for 2 days, waiting for the signal to clear. He scrolled through them on the walk back, mostly routine, supply confirmations, a maintenance reminder, a complaint from the processing station about output numbers, until one alert near the top of the queue stopped him cold in the middle of the path, boots crunching to a halt on the gritty regolith. It wasn't from anyone he knew. It was a broad emergency broadcast, the kind that got pushed to every receiver in range regardless of clearance level, urgent enough to override standard filtering, and it was searching, frantically, by the look of the repeated pings and escalating priority flags, for any sign of a vessel matching a very specific, very familiar description, last confirmed in this exact sector. Kael read it twice, the cold of the moon's thin air suddenly feeling considerably colder, and then he looked back toward the shelter, where a woman who called herself just Thessara was waiting with strict instructions not to be heroic, and felt the entire shape of the last 2 days quietly, completely rearrange itself in his head. Kael walked back to the shelter slower than he'd walked out to the tower, which gave him roughly 15 minutes to have several increasingly unhelpful internal reactions to the broadcast still glowing on his handheld. His first reaction was denial, of the very practical variety. Surely there were lots of ships matching that description. Surely the galaxy was full of iridescent hull plating and curveless architecture and emergency descents that carved half-kilometer trenches into unsuspecting moons. Surely this was a coincidence, and not the specific, exact, unmistakable coincidence it obviously was. His second reaction was doing actual math, the kind that didn't lie to him the way denial did, and the math came back the same every time. One ship, one location, one set of injuries that matched precisely, and a search broadcast urgent enough to override every filter in the sector, which was not the kind of effort anyone spent looking for a missing cargo hauler. His third reaction, arriving somewhere around the shelter door, was the abrupt, vivid memory of every single joke he'd made over the last 2 days. The sandwich, the socks, the deeply, deeply sad food, the unsolicited commentary on her snoring, which he had absolutely delivered with confidence twice to a woman who, if the broadcast was even halfway accurate, answered to titles longer than his entire employment file. "Oh no," Kael said to the door to the moon, to whatever cosmic sense of humor had arranged this. "Oh no, no, no." He opened the door to find Thessara exactly where he'd left her, leg elevated, looking entirely too composed for someone about to have her secret detonated by an engineer holding a glowing handheld like it had personally betrayed him. "You fixed the tower," she said. "I fixed the tower." He held up the handheld, not quite able to keep the slightly strangled note out of his voice, and the tower had some things to say to me, about a ship, matching some very specific descriptions, belonging to, and I want to be clear, I am reading this directly off the broadcast, and not making any of it up myself, Queen Thessara of the Veloran Dominion, currently the subject of the largest search operation this sector has seen in a decade. The silence that followed had a texture to it, dense and complicated, the kind of silence that contained an entire conversation neither of them had said out loud yet. "Ah," Thessara said finally. "Ah," Kael repeated. "That's yes. Ah. That's the word I'd use too, if I were currently realizing I made fun of a queen snoring. You did make fun of my snoring. I deeply regret it now. You shouldn't, it was accurate." The corner of her mouth twitched, fighting against the gravity of the moment and clearly winning, because a moment later she was almost smiling, watching him with an expression that had finally, fully dropped the wariness he'd seen flicker in and out of it for 2 days. "You really had no idea." "I had several ideas. None of them were queen. My best guess was corporate executive with excellent posture. My second best guess was extremely well-funded smuggler." He sat down heavily across from her, the adrenaline of the walk back finally catching up to him in the form of a need to sit somewhere stable. At no point did, sovereign of an entire stellar dominion, make the list. I want that on record. I treated you like a regular crash victim because, as far as I knew, You were a regular crash victim who happened to have nice ears and strong opinions about my cooking. I know, she said, and something in the way she said it carried more weight than the two simple words should have held. That's rather the point. He looked at her properly then, the pieces shifting into a different shape entirely. You let me think that. On purpose. At first it wasn't on purpose. I was in shock, and giving you my title felt like a great deal of effort I didn't have available. She shifted against the wall, the splinted leg adjusting carefully, buying herself a second before continuing. But after that first night, when you were calm and competent and ridiculous about your sandwich, I realized I had an opportunity I have never had in my entire life, which is to find out what it's like to be helped by someone with absolutely nothing to gain from helping me. No favor to curry, no alliance to secure, just a person doing their job for another person because that's what the job is. She met his eyes, steady now. You have no idea how rare that is for someone in my position. Everyone who has ever cared for me has also, somewhere in the back of their mind, been calculating what that care might earn them. You weren't calculating anything. You were just annoyed about your sandwich and committed to keeping me alive anyway. Kael sat with that for a moment, the joke he'd been about to make dissolving somewhere on the way to his mouth. That's actually a little sad when you put it that way. It's the truth, which is sometimes the same thing as sad. She allowed the smile back, lighter this time. You, on the other hand, were exactly as irritating to me as you would have been to anyone. You criticized my opinions about your music. You made me eat that terrible paste. You woke me up every 2 hours out of what I can only describe as bureaucratic spite. Concussion protocol. Bureaucratic spite, she repeated, wearing a lab coat, and it was the most honest 2 days I've had in years. Before Kael could decide how to respond to that, the shelter's exterior sensors chimed with the specific, layered urgency of multiple incoming vessels. And through the window he watched the sky fill with the kind of formal, official, deeply impressive arrival that Havers Ridge had never once hosted in its entire unglamorous history. Search and rescue craft in colors he didn't recognize, sleek and fast and clearly expensive, descending with the controlled precision of people who had spent the last 2 days rehearsing exactly how relieved they were about to be. What followed was, in Kael's professional assessment, the single most chaotic 20 minutes of his career, eclipsing even the year of the gray sock incident. Officials poured out of the ships in formal uniforms that made his work jacket look like something fished out of a recycling bin, several of them visibly fighting back tears at the sight of Thesara upright and breathing, all of them treating Kael with a bewildering mixture of effusive gratitude and barely concealed disbelief that he had apparently spent 2 days addressing their missing sovereign as you, instead of whatever the correct honorific was supposed to be. I genuinely didn't know, Kael told the 4th official who asked, hands raised in surrender. If I'd known, I would have used nicer bandages. I want that noted somewhere official. The bandages were standard issue. They would have been upgraded. He keeps saying that. Thesara informed her retinue, with visible enjoyment, from her position being carefully transferred to a proper medical stretcher, that made his own field kit look almost embarrassing by comparison. About the bandages, they genuinely were standard issue, Kael said again, to no one in particular, because apparently it was the detail his brain had chosen to fixate on under pressure. When the formal commendations started, and they started fast, officials already murmuring about compensation packages and honors, and the kind of bureaucratic machinery that existed specifically to reward people who'd accidentally rescued royalty. Kael felt the familiar itch of wanting to be anywhere else, a feeling he expressed by attempting, unsuccessfully, to back toward his crawler before anyone noticed. Thesara noticed. "Wait," she said, raising a hand, and the entire assembled retinue went quiet with the speed of people very used to that particular gesture. "Before anyone formalizes anything, I want it understood by all of you and by him that what happened here wasn't a rescue performed for a queen. It was care given to a person, by someone who had no idea there was a difference, and that is worth more to me than every properly briefed bodyguard and politically cautious physician I have ever had. She looked at Kael directly. I'm not thanking you for saving the queen. I'm thanking you for the 2 days you spent being annoyed at someone you thought was nobody in particular, and treating her exactly as well as you'd treat anyone else. That's not a small thing. I don't think you understand yet how small that thing actually is. Kael, who had braced himself for ceremony and gotten something considerably more disarming instead, found himself uncharacteristically short of a joke. I'll send you an invoice, he managed eventually, for emotional damages. Cost of recalibrating 2 days of memories now that I know who I was making fun of. Send it, Thesara said, settling back as they prepared to move her stretcher toward the ship, the smile still there, easier now than it had been at any point since the crash. I'll pay it personally. Consider it the first honest transaction either of us has had all week. He watched them load her aboard, watched the fleet that had descended like a small storm of its own begin preparing to lift off into a sky finally, fully clear, and felt the strange, settling weight of understanding that something had happened here that wouldn't fit neatly into his next maintenance report. Not a rescue, exactly. Not a romance, not a political alliance, nothing the official records would know how to properly categorize. Just 2 days where neither of them had known what the other was worth on paper, and had decided without ever discussing it that paper wasn't really the point. As the ships rose into the thin atmosphere and the moon went quiet again, Kael turned back toward his shelter, toward his ruined sandwich and his terrible music, and the relay tower he'd fixed without ever properly cleaning up afterward, and found that the loneliness of Havers Ridge felt, for the first time in a long while, like something he'd chosen rather than something he'd simply ended up with, not because anything had been resolved or promised, but because he now knew, with total certainty, that the version of himself he'd been for those 2 days, unimpressed and unguarded and genuinely present, was a version worth being again, for whoever crashed into his life next, crown or no crown, ears pointed or otherwise.